In Excel Project 3, I ask you to compute a scatter plot and, to construct a scatter plot and then to compute the correlation, the r squared, the slope, the intercept of the least squares regression line. So I'll show you how to do that here. Maybe I'll label some things here. Correlation r, and then r squared. Okay, so I give you the functions to use for each of these things. I'll start with the correlation. I ask you to use the correl function. Okay, so of course you can click on the help file for these to see examples of how to implement them. Here I'm looking at two arrays. Okay. The file I'm working on here is the manatee deaths versus boat registrations that we used in the notes. Okay, so here I want to compare the boats registered to the kills. Remember, correlation doesn't distinguish between the explanatory and the response variable. Okay, so I could calculate the correlation between those two. Just that way, in this case, my correlation is very high, and I could use r squared. Now remember, r squared does distinguish between the explanatory and response variables. So the order in which I put things here matters. I'm looking for the known y's first. Okay, so the y's are the response variable. Looking for the manatee deaths to be the response variable. And then the number of boats does the explaining. Okay, and so there's my r squared. Okay, similarly here, if I calculate the slope of the least squares regression line, it matters which order I put things in. Okay, I do the y's first, then the x's, the response variable, then the explanatory variable. It'll calculate these things just like so. Okay, so I can get negative values, all that's perfectly fine. And then we can combine this with what we did in Excel Project 1 to create a scatter plot. So I'm inserting a new type of chart. This is a scatter plot. So there we go. All right, now the thing that you need to focus on for Excel Project 3 is that your correlation, or your r squared value, needs to match up with the image you're presenting here. So in this case, I've got a fairly strong positive linear association. Okay? But you see I've got this sort of dead white space over here. So I'm going to format this axis. Okay, I don't have any values that start below 400, so I'll change that. Okay, now this looks pretty good. Label this manatee deaths versus boats registered in Florida. Now I also ask you to label the x and y axes so I know which is which here. Okay, so I've got things set up the right way. At the moment, if I wanted to add an axes label, sorry, go back here. Okay, so I can add a linear trend line if I want. Axis titles, okay, so my primary horizontal here. I need to make sure that things are actually displayed correctly here. So if I've got my axis title on the horizontal axis, I've got boats registered in Florida. That's what that axis is telling me, and then I'll add vertical axis, these are manatee deaths. Okay. If you need to, you can always sort of click on these things. If I want to format the data series, I can change the appearance of these things. If things are backwards, if you've got your response variable on the horizontal axis, then you can always switch the rows and columns, and that will take care of that for you. Okay, and then you can do any sort of formatting that you want. You know, you can change colors if you're interested in any of that, but certainly not required. Okay, maybe I want to fill here, something like that. Okay, so I can change my border colors, all that sort of stuff, but I want to get something that visually looks like what my summary statistics will actually be saying. Okay, so I need to make sure that the image presented matches up with my correlation R and R squared. Remember, so I can always use this line with this slope and this intercept to make a prediction. It's not necessarily useful. Okay? Whether or not it's useful depends on the values of R and or R squared. Okay, so we want the absolute value of R to be greater than about 0.5. So in this case, the prediction made by this line would be useful. If R was less than about 0.5, then it's probably not useful.